She calls him from the kitchen, her voice sweet and caring, telling him dinner is ready. He sits down at the table, excited because it's his birthday, his 31st, and she's made his absolute favorite meal. A curry so hot it makes his eyes water, just the way he likes it. He takes the first bite, and the heat explodes across his tongue, masking everything else. He doesn't taste the bitterness hiding beneath the spices. He doesn't know that the woman sitting across from him, smiling and wishing him happy birthday, has just served him his last meal. By tomorrow morning, Julian Webb will be dead, and his wife will already be at his workplace, asking about his death benefits. But here's what makes this case truly chilling. Julian wasn't her first victim, and he wouldn't be her last target. So what turns someone into a serial deceiver, a bigamist, a thief, and ultimately, a murderer? And how did she nearly get away with it all? Let's rewind to where it all began. Dena Thompson was born in the year 1960, in Hendon, a suburb in North London, into what appears from the outside to be an ordinary working-class family. Her father works as a prison warder, a job that requires discipline, authority, and an understanding of human behavior at its most troubled. Her mother stays home, managing the household. To neighbors and acquaintances, the Holmes family seems unremarkable, the kind of family you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But something happens during Dena's childhood and teenage years, something that investigating officers would later describe as troubled, without providing explicit details. Detectives who eventually piece together her life story note that her early years seem to have planted seeds of resentment, particularly toward men. Detective Chief Inspector Martyn Underhill, who would lead the investigation into her crimes, observes that the events of her childhood appear to have created a deep-seated hatred. "I think the events of her childhood have made her hate men," he says during the investigation. "If you look at her life, it is always men she has targeted." By her early 20s, Dena is working at a building society, one of those trusted financial institutions where people deposit their savings, apply for mortgages, and plan their futures. She presents herself as reliable, competent, and trustworthy. She dresses professionally, speaks politely, and performs her duties without raising suspicion. But beneath this carefully constructed surface, something else is developing, a talent for deception and an appetite for other people's money. It's during this period, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, that Dena begins experimenting with what will become her signature method of operation. She starts placing personal advertisements in local newspapers, what people call Lonely Hearts columns. These small classified ads are where people seeking companionship, romance, or simply connection reach out into the void, hoping someone will respond. In an era before internet dating, before swiping left or right, these columns are how lonely people find each other. And Dena quickly realizes they're also how vulnerable people can be found and exploited. She crafts her advertisements carefully, presenting herself as attractive, interesting, and available. When men respond, she meets them, assesses them, and begins weaving elaborate stories. She tells one man she has terminal cancer and needs money for treatment. She tells another she's in desperate financial trouble through no fault of her own and just needs a loan to get back on her feet. She promises to pay them back, of course. She always promises. And because she's charming, because she seems genuine, because she looks them in the eye and makes them feel special, they believe her. Detectives would later identify around a dozen men who were romanced and defrauded by Dena during these early years. A schoolteacher resigns from his position and hands over his life savings after she convinces him she's dying. A customs officer at Gatwick Airport is left financially ruined and stranded during a trip to Florida after she drains his accounts. Each time, she takes a few £1,000s, not enough to trigger major investigations, but enough to fund her lifestyle. Each time, she disappears before the men fully realize what's happened. But Dena isn't satisfied with small-scale cons. She wants more. More money, more control, more power over the men she targets. And so, in the year 1984, she takes her operation to the next level. She gets married. Her first husband is Lee Wyatt, an electrician in his 40s who's lonely after a failed marriage. He's exactly the kind of man Dena has learned to identify: vulnerable, financially stable, and desperate for connection. They meet through a Lonely Hearts advertisement, and Lee later recalls that at first, Dena seems like the best thing that ever happened to me. She moves in with him. They marry. In the year 1987, they have a son together. From the outside, it looks like a normal family. But inside the marriage, Dena is systematically draining Lee of everything he has. She persuades him to give her £3,000 for a house deposit that never materializes. She takes £1,500 for a car. She extracts £1,000 for vague business expenses. She secretly takes out loans in his name, forging his signature on documents. Lee, trusting his wife, doesn't realize the extent of the theft until it's too late. And then Dena does something that reveals just how calculating she truly is. While working at the Woolwich Building Society, she steals £23,000 from customer accounts, a serious crime that could send her to prison. But instead of simply taking the money and hoping she won't get caught, she tries to frame Lee for the theft. She creates false documents, forges letters, and attempts to make it look like her husband is the criminal. It doesn't work. In the year 1995, Dena is convicted of 7 counts of theft and 2 counts of forgery. She's sentenced to 18 months in prison. It's her first time behind bars, but it won't be her last. Here's what's chilling about this moment. Most people, after being caught and imprisoned, would reconsider their choices. They might feel shame, fear, or regret. They might decide to change their ways. But Dena Thompson doesn't seem to experience any of these emotions. Instead, prison appears to be simply an inconvenience, a temporary setback in her larger plans. Because while she's serving her sentence, she's already thinking about her next target. And this time, she won't just steal. This time, she'll kill. Julian Webb is 30 years old when he meets Dena Thompson, and by all accounts, he's exactly the kind of man who should have a bright future ahead of him. He works as an advertising manager, a job that requires creativity, communication skills, and the ability to understand what makes people tick. He's good at his work, well-liked by his colleagues, and financially stable. He enjoys outdoor activities, fishing, hiking, spending time in nature. Friends describe him as optimistic, trusting, and perhaps a bit naive when it comes to matters of the heart. Julian is also a man who loves food, particularly spicy food. He's the kind of person who, when dining at an Indian restaurant, asks the waiter to make his curry as hot as possible, then adds extra chili sauce on top. His friends joke about his cast iron stomach, his ability to handle heat that would make most people reach for a glass of milk. It's a quirk, a personality trait, something that makes Julian who he is. It's also, tragically, the detail that will make him the perfect victim. In the year 1991, Julian is single and looking for companionship. Like many people in the era before widespread internet use, he turns to the Lonely Hearts columns in local newspapers. He places an advertisement or responds to one. The exact details are lost to time, and somehow, he connects with Dena Thompson. She's recently out of prison, though Julian doesn't know this. She's still legally married to Lee Wyatt, though Julian doesn't know this either. What Julian knows is that Dena seems wonderful, attractive, interesting, attentive. She makes him feel special, desired, understood. Their relationship develops quickly, too quickly. In retrospect, it's a whirlwind romance, the kind where everything feels intense and urgent and meant to be. Within just 3 months of meeting, Julian and Dena decide to get married. Julian's mother, Rosemary Webb, is concerned. She warns her son that he barely knows this woman, that rushing into marriage is dangerous, that he should slow down and be careful. But Julian is in love, or what he believes is love, and he doesn't listen. In August the year 1991, Julian and Dena marry at Chichester Registry Office in West Sussex. It's a small ceremony, nothing elaborate. What makes it significant and illegal is that Dena is still married to Lee Wyatt. This isn't just morally questionable, it's bigamy, a criminal offense in the UK. But Dena doesn't care about legalities. She cares about access to Julian's bank accounts, his assets, his life insurance, his death benefits. After the wedding, Julian and Dena move into a home together in Yapton, a small village near Arundel in West Sussex. It's a quiet, picturesque area, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and crime rates are low. Julian continues working, earning a steady income, while Dena takes control of their finances. She convinces him to give her access to his bank accounts. She learns about his pension plan, his life insurance policy, the death in service benefit his employer provides. She asks questions that seem caring on the surface. What would happen to me if something happened to you, but are actually reconnaissance, gathering information for a plan that's already forming in her mind. Julian's relationship with his mother becomes strained during this period. Dena limits their contact, screening phone calls, making excuses for why Julian can't visit or why they can't come over. It's a classic isolation tactic, one that abusers use to cut their victims off from support systems. Rosemary senses something is wrong, but she doesn't know what. She just knows that her son seems different, more distant, less like himself. What Julian doesn't realize is that he's living with a woman who has already defrauded multiple men, who has already been to prison, who is already planning her next move. He doesn't know that Dena sees him not as a husband but as a resource to be exploited. He doesn't know that every kind gesture, every loving word, every home-cooked meal is part of a performance designed to keep him compliant until she's ready to strike. And he certainly doesn't know that his love of spicy food, that innocent quirk that makes him who he is, will be weaponized against him. The days leading up to 6th of June, the year 1994, are ordinary in the Webb household, at least on the surface. Julian goes to work, comes home, spends time with Dena. They talk about his upcoming birthday, make plans for a quiet celebration at home. Dena seems attentive, loving, excited to make the day special for him. She asks what he'd like for dinner, and Julian, predictably, says he'd love a really hot curry, the kind that makes his eyes water and his forehead sweat. Dena smiles and says she'll make him the hottest curry he's ever had. What Julian doesn't know is that Dena has been obtaining prescription antidepressants, specifically a tricyclic antidepressant called dothipin. These medications, when taken as prescribed, help people manage depression and anxiety. But when taken in large quantities, they're lethal. They cause cardiac arrhythmias, seizures, respiratory failure, and death. And they have one particular characteristic that makes them perfect for Dena's plan. They taste extremely bitter. Under normal circumstances, if you tried to give someone a lethal dose of dothipin, they'd taste it immediately and spit it out. The bitterness would be overwhelming, impossible to disguise in most foods. But Dena has realized something clever, something diabolical. If you hide the medication in a curry that's already intensely spicy, loaded with chili peppers, hot sauce, and other powerful flavors, the bitterness gets masked. The victim's taste buds are so overwhelmed by the heat that they don't notice the poison underneath. It's a perfect murder weapon, tailored specifically to Julian's preferences and habits. On 6th of June, the year 1994, Julian's 31st birthday, Dena prepares the curry. She grinds up the dothipin tablets, mixing the powder into the sauce, along with ground aspirin, which will enhance the toxic effects. She makes the curry as hot as Julian likes it, hotter, even. She wants to make absolutely sure he won't taste anything unusual. She serves it to him with a smile, with birthday wishes, with all the performance of a loving wife celebrating her husband's special day. Julian eats the curry. He probably comments on how hot it is, how good it tastes, how she's really outdone herself this time. He probably thanks her, kisses her, tells her he loves her, and all the while, the poison is entering his system, beginning its deadly work. Within hours, Julian starts feeling unwell. He complains of nausea, dizziness, confusion. His heart rate becomes irregular. He's sweating, trembling, struggling to breathe properly. These are all symptoms of dothipin overdose. But to someone who doesn't know what's happening, they might seem like food poisoning or a sudden illness. Dena watches him deteriorate. She doesn't call for help. She doesn't phone an ambulance. She doesn't do any of the things a concerned spouse would do when their partner is clearly in medical distress. At some point during the evening, Julian's mother, Rosemary, calls to wish her son a happy birthday. She wants to speak to him, to hear his voice, to tell him she loves him. But Dena answers the phone and tells Rosemary that Julian is too unwell to come to the phone. Rosemary, concerned, tells Dena to call a doctor immediately. Dena says she will. She doesn't. Instead, Dena helps Julian to bed, where he continues to deteriorate throughout the night. His breathing becomes more labored. His heart struggles to maintain a regular rhythm. His body is shutting down, system by system, as the poison does its work. And Dena sits nearby, waiting, watching, making sure he doesn't recover. By the morning of 7th of June, the year 1994, Julian Webb is dead. He's 31 years old. He's been married for 3 years. He's been poisoned by the woman he trusted most in the world. Killed in his own home, on his birthday, with a meal he specifically requested. And Dena's first action after his death isn't to call emergency services. It isn't to notify his family. It isn't to grieve or cry or show any sign of the devastation a spouse should feel when their partner dies suddenly. Instead, she goes to Julian's workplace and asks about his death benefits. It's a stunning display of cold calculation. one that would later shock investigators and prosecutors. Within hours of Julian's death, literally the next morning, Dena is already trying to collect the £36,000 payout from his pension plan. She's not even pretending to be in mourning. She's not waiting a respectful amount of time. She's moving immediately to cash in on the murder she's just committed. But here's where Dena's plan hits its first snag. Julian's mother, Rosemary Webb, is suspicious. She knows something isn't right about her son's sudden death. She knows Dena prevented her from speaking to Julian on his birthday. She knows Dena didn't call a doctor despite being told to do so. And when she learns that Dena is already trying to claim Julian's death benefits, her suspicions deepen. Rosemary does some investigating of her own and makes a crucial discovery. Dena was still married to Lee Wyatt when she married Julian. This means the marriage was bigamous, legally invalid. And if the marriage wasn't legal, then Dena isn't Julian's next of kin. She has no right to his death benefits, his pension, or any of his assets. Rosemary blocks the payout. Dena is furious, but there's nothing she can do. The money she killed for is suddenly out of reach. An inquest is held into Julian's death. The initial examination doesn't reveal anything obviously suspicious. Julian was young and apparently healthy, but sudden deaths do happen. The coroner records an open verdict, meaning the cause of death is uncertain. It could have been suicide. It could have been an accidental overdose. It could have been natural causes. Without clear evidence of foul play, the case is closed. Dena tries to have Julian's body cremated, which would destroy any physical evidence of poisoning. But Rosemary, still suspicious, manages to prevent the cremation. Julian is buried instead, his body intact, preserved in the ground. At the time, this seems like a small victory for a grieving mother who simply wants to honor her son's memory. But years later, it will prove to be the decision that brings Dena Thompson to justice. Because that preserved body, lying in its grave, contains evidence. And when technology advances and investigators finally take a closer look, that evidence will speak louder than any witness testimony. But in the year 1994, none of this has happened yet. In the year 1994, Dena Thompson walks away from Julian Webb's death without facing any consequences. She doesn't get the money she wanted, but she doesn't face any charges either. She's free to move on, to find her next victim, to continue her pattern of deception and exploitation. And that's exactly what she does. Because Dena Thompson wasn't done killing. She was just getting started. After Julian's death, Dena moves away from West Sussex and eventually settles in a new area, ready to reinvent herself once again. She divorces Lee Wyatt, finally making her first marriage legally over, and begins looking for her next target. In the year 1998, she meets Richard Thompson, a 42-year-old man who, like Lee Wyatt and Julian Webb before him, is lonely after a failed marriage and looking for companionship. They meet through, you guessed it, a Lonely Hearts advertisement. Dena has refined her approach over the years, and she knows exactly how to present herself to appeal to vulnerable men. She's charming, attentive, and seemingly genuine. Richard falls for her quickly, and they marry later that year. But this time, Dena's pattern accelerates. She doesn't spend years slowly draining Richard's finances. Instead, she moves quickly and aggressively. She tells him she's won £300,000 on the national lottery and that they're going to start a new life together in America. Richard, thrilled by this apparent windfall, begins making plans. He doesn't realize that there is no lottery win, that it's all a fabrication designed to explain why Dena needs access to his money, his property, his assets. Dena convinces Richard to take out loans. She forges his signature on documents. She empties his bank accounts. She contacts estate agents about selling his house, telling them that Richard will be moving to Florida and won't need the property anymore. She's setting up her exit strategy, planning to take everything and disappear, leaving Richard financially ruined and confused. But Dena has also learned something from Julian's death. Sometimes, it's easier to just kill them. On 1st of January, the year 2000, as the new millennium begins, Dena approaches Richard with a proposition. She suggests they try something exciting in the bedroom, something adventurous. She asks if she can tie him up and blindfold him, frame it as a romantic game, a way to spice up their relationship. Richard, trusting his wife, agrees. Dena binds Richard's hands and feet with masking tape. She covers his eyes with a blindfold. She positions him on the bathroom floor, vulnerable and helpless, and then she leaves the room. When she returns, she's carrying a baseball bat and a carving knife. What happens next is a scene of shock. Dena strikes Richard in the head with the baseball bat, causing him to bleed profusely. She attacks him with the knife, trying to inflict fatal wounds. But Richard, despite being bound and blindfolded, manages to free his hands. He fights back, struggling with Dena, forcing her to drop the knife. Blood is pouring from his head wound, but adrenaline and survival instinct keep him conscious and fighting. Finally, Dena stops. She breaks down, and in a moment of apparent honesty, she says, "It's all been a lie. I've spent all your money." Richard, bleeding and traumatized, realizes that the woman he married has just tried to kill him. He manages to get free, to get away from her. Dena leaves the house, and Richard is left alone, trying to process what's just happened. The next day, something surreal occurs. An estate agent shows up at Richard's door, explaining that Dena has arranged for the house to be sold, and that he expected Richard would already be in Florida. Richard realizes the full extent of Dena's plan. She was going to kill him, sell his house, while everyone thought he was in America, and disappear with the money. It was a nearly perfect plan, one that might have worked if Richard hadn't managed to fight back. Richard contacts the police, and Dena is arrested. When officers begin investigating her background, they discover her previous conviction for theft and forgery. They interview her former partners and find a consistent pattern. Every man Dena has been involved with has been defrauded, manipulated, and financially destroyed. They realize they're dealing with a serial predator, someone who has been operating for years. Detective Chief Inspector Martyn Underhill is a seasoned investigator, someone who's seen the worst of human behavior and learned to trust his instincts. When he looks at Dena Thompson's history, the pattern of deception, the escalating violence, the suspicious death of Julian Webb, he sees something that others have missed. He sees a killer who's been operating in plain sight for years. But instinct isn't enough. Underhill needs evidence, and the only place to find it is in Julian Webb's grave. In October, the year 2001, 7 years after Julian's death, his body is exhumed from the cemetery in West Sussex. It's a somber, careful process, one that requires legal authorization and meticulous documentation. Rosemary Webb, who has never stopped believing that her son was murdered, watches as investigators carefully remove the coffin from the ground. She's waited years for this moment, years of knowing something was wrong but being unable to prove it. The body is transported to a forensic laboratory, where pathologists conduct a thorough post-mortem examination using modern techniques that weren't available in 1994. They take tissue samples, run toxicology tests, analyze every detail of Julian's remains, and they find exactly what Underhill suspected: lethal levels of dothipin, the tricyclic antidepressant, along with significant amounts of aspirin. The concentrations are far too high to be consistent with therapeutic use or even accidental overdose. This is poisoning, deliberate and calculated. But Underhill still needs to understand how Dena administered the poison without Julian noticing. That's when he travels to the United States to interview Don Hudson, a friend of Julian's who had moved to Florida years earlier. Don and Julian had been fishing buddies, and they'd stayed in touch through letters. After Julian's death, Dena had called Don to inform him of what happened, and during that conversation, she'd said something that seemed innocuous at the time but now takes on sinister significance. She told Don that Julian had eaten a really hot curry shortly before he died. When Underhill hears this, everything clicks into place. He consults with toxicologists and pharmacologists, asking them a specific question: can you disguise the bitter taste of dothipin in a very spicy curry? The answer is yes. Absolutely yes. Underhill later describes this moment as his Pandora's box, the revelation that makes everything else make sense. Dena knew Julian loved extremely spicy food. She knew the heat would mask the bitterness of the medication. She'd weaponized his own preferences against him, turning something he enjoyed into the delivery system for his murder. But Underhill isn't done investigating. He wants to understand the full scope of Dena's crimes, to identify all her victims, to build the strongest possible case. His team interviews dozens of men who had relationships with Dena over the years. They hear story after story of manipulation, theft, and emotional abuse. They estimate that Dena defrauded her victims of approximately £500,000 over 2 decades. They also discover something deeply troubling. Dena had a boyfriend in the 1970s and 1980s, a Bulgarian man named Stoyan Kostov. He disappeared while traveling between Bulgaria and the UK, and he's never been found. Investigators suspect Dena may have killed him as well, but without a body or concrete evidence, they can't prove it. In August, the year 2002, Dena Thompson is arrested at her home in Colompton, Devon, and charged with the murder of Julian Webb. She's been out of prison for less than a year after serving her sentence for defrauding Richard Thompson. Now she's facing a life sentence. The trial begins at the Old Bailey in London in November the year 2003. It lasts 5 weeks, and the evidence presented is overwhelming. The prosecution lays out Dena's entire history, the pattern of deception, the bigamist marriages, the thefts, the violence. They present the toxicology reports showing lethal levels of poison in Julian's body. They bring in Don Hudson, who testifies about the really hot curry comment they call Rosemary Webb, who describes how Dena prevented her from speaking to her son on his birthday and refused to call a doctor. The defense argues that Julian committed suicide, that he was depressed and took the overdose himself. But the prosecution counters with a simple question. Why would a man who was celebrating his birthday, who had plans for the future, who showed no signs of suicidal ideation, suddenly decide to kill himself with his wife's antidepressants? And why would his wife, if she truly believed it was suicide, immediately go to his workplace to ask about death benefits instead of calling for help or notifying his family? The jury deliberates and reaches a verdict, guilty of murder. On 15th of December, the year 2003, Dena Thompson is sentenced to life imprisonment. Judge Michael Hyam tells her, "You brought about Julian Webb's death by poisoning him. What you did was utterly ruthless and without pity. Nothing can excuse you for the wickedness of what you did." In the year 2007, the High Court sets a minimum term of 16 years, meaning Dena won't be eligible for parole until the year 2019, at the earliest. Detective Chief Inspector Underhill speaks to the press after the conviction, and his words are chilling. "This woman is every man's nightmare, the most dangerous woman I have ever met. For a decade, she has targeted men sexually, financially, and physically. The men of Britain can sleep safe tonight knowing she has been taken off the streets." But here's the question that haunts everyone involved in the case. How many other victims were there? How many men did Dena Thompson target, exploit, and possibly harm before she was finally caught? And if Richard Thompson hadn't managed to fight back, if Rosemary Webb hadn't insisted on preserving her son's body, if Detective Underhill hadn't trusted his instincts and reopened the investigation, would Dena still be out there, still hunting, still killing? After her conviction in 2003, Dena Thompson begins serving her life sentence in the British prison system. She's initially held in a closed prison, where security is tight and movement is restricted. For someone who spent decades manipulating and controlling others, prison represents a complete loss of power. She can no longer charm her way out of situations. She can no longer reinvent herself with a new identity. She's simply Prisoner Thompson, convicted murderer. By the year 2016, Dena has been transferred to HM Prison Send, a closed women's prison in Surrey. She's been behind bars for 13 years, and she's beginning to think about parole. Under the terms of her sentence, she becomes eligible for parole consideration in the year 2019 after serving 16 years. In April the year 2022, the Parole Board announces that they will hold a hearing to consider Dena's release. The news sparks immediate controversy. Richard Thompson, who survived Dena's attempt to kill him, speaks out publicly saying, "She definitely tried to kill me, and they proved that she murdered her second husband. So, she would have been a serial killer if she had been successful, and God knows what else she has done." Richard also reveals that he wasn't officially notified about the parole hearing, despite being a victim of Dena's crimes. He's angry, frustrated, and frightened at the prospect of Dena being released. "She should not be released," he tells reporters. "Of course not." Sean MacDonald, one of the officers who investigated Dena's crimes, expresses similar concerns. "I believe she will reoffend. She won't be able to stop herself. She has no remorse but will be the model prisoner and say all the right things. Her potential release concerns me and everybody who has been involved with her." But despite these objections, the Parole Board makes its decision. On 23rd of May, the year 2022, they announced that Dena Thompson will be released on parole. She's served 19 years, 3 years more than her minimum term, and the board has determined that she can be safely managed in the community. The decision comes with strict conditions. Dena must wear an electronic tag that monitors her location at all times. She must observe a curfew, staying at her designated residence during certain hours. She must disclose all personal relationships and financial activities to her probation officer. She cannot contact any of her victims or their families. She must attend regular meetings with her probation officer and participate in ongoing supervision. If she violates any of these conditions, she can be immediately recalled to prison. In early June the year 2022, Dena Thompson walks out of prison a free woman. She's 62 years old. She spent nearly 2 decades behind bars, and now she's back in society, living somewhere in the UK under supervision. In August the year 2022, she's spotted out shopping, living her life, blending back into the community. To people who don't know her history, she probably looks like an ordinary older woman, someone's grandmother, perhaps, harmless and unremarkable. But to those who know what she's capable of, her release is terrifying. The question everyone is asking is, has Dena Thompson really changed? Can someone who spent decades manipulating, defrauding, and murdering truly be rehabilitated? Or is she simply doing what she's always done, playing a role, saying the right things, waiting for the right opportunity? The Parole Board believes she's changed. They've reviewed the evidence, conducted the assessments, and determined that she's no longer a significant risk. But they've been wrong before. The criminal justice system has been wrong before. And the consequences of being wrong about Dena Thompson could be catastrophic. First, we need to understand the psychology of serial manipulation. Dena wasn't simply a con artist who occasionally resorted to violence. She was someone who appeared to lack empathy, who viewed other people as resources to be exploited, rather than as human beings with their own rights and dignity. Psychologists who've studied her case note characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder, a pattern of disregard for others, a lack of remorse, a tendency toward manipulation and deceit, and an inability to form genuine emotional connections. But here's what's important. Not everyone with antisocial personality disorder becomes a murderer. Most don't. What made Dena particularly dangerous was the combination of her psychological traits, with her intelligence, her patience, and her ability to identify and exploit vulnerability. She was strategic, calculating, and willing to play the long game. She could maintain a facade for years if necessary, all while planning her next move. Thank you for staying with us through this difficult but important story. The case of Dena Thompson, the Black Widow, is one that challenges our assumptions, tests our understanding of human nature, and reminds us why true crime isn't just entertainment. It's education, it's awareness, it's a way of learning to recognize danger and protect ourselves and the people we love. If this case affected you, if it made you think differently about relationships, trust, or the nature of evil, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What stood out to you most? Was it Dena's decades-long pattern of deception, the tragic death of Julian Webb, the courage of Richard Thompson in fighting back, the persistence of Rosemary Webb in seeking justice for her son? Or perhaps it was the controversial decision to release Dena on parole after 19 years. These are complex questions without easy answers, and we believe the best discussions happen when people with different perspectives come together respectfully to share their thoughts. So please, take a moment to leave a comment. Tell us what you think. Ask questions. Share your own experiences if you feel comfortable doing so. And if you found this video valuable, if you learned something, or if it made you more aware of warning signs in relationships, please consider liking this video and sharing it with others. True crime content serves an important purpose when it educates and informs, and your shares help us reach people who might benefit from hearing these stories. We also invite you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We cover cases from across the UK and beyond, always with the goal of honoring victims, understanding perpetrators, and learning lessons that can make us all safer and more aware. We take these stories seriously, we research them thoroughly, and we present them with the respect they deserve. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next video.